Sure. Okay, so this works? All right, great. So what I want to do is just briefly run through a couple of things that everyone in this chapel this morning can do based upon what we learned last night. And what I kind of want to do is turn back the clock to the winter of 1972. The winter of 1972, so maybe October, November, December. What if we could go back in time, seeing that Roe v. Wade was about to happen in January of 1973? What would we have wanted to do as a community to prevent Roe v. Wade from happening in 1973, or minimizing the negative impacts that Roe would have? That's kind of the situation that we're in today. In April, the Supreme Court will be hearing oral arguments on marriage cases that came out of the Sixth Circuit, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan. These citizens in those 4 states went to the ballot boxes. They passed laws that defined marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Unelected judges at the district court level threw out those votes, but then the Sixth Circuit Court reversed. They actually said, no, these are good laws. They upheld the laws in the Sixth Circuit. So now the Supreme Court is reviewing those cases. What can we do in the run-up to that case? It'll be heard in April. The decision is likely to come down at the end of June. Obamacare is back in the Supreme Court this term, and marriage cases are back at the Supreme Court this term. These will be the 2 biggest cases of the year for the Supreme Court, and those will be the 2 cases that they decide on at the very end of the term. In the same way that they did the Hobby Lobby decision on the very last day of last term, they'll do the marriage cases and Obamacare in the very last days of this term. So let me just run through a couple of things that we can do. First is to champion the actual Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires the states to redefine marriage. Not the 14th Amendment, not equal protection, not fundamental rights to marry, not analogies to interracial marriage. You go through the US Constitution and there's nothing there that forces the states to redefine marriage. Partly because there's nothing in the US Constitution that says what marriage is. And so unelected judges shouldn't insert their own beliefs about what marriage is and then say the Constitution requires all 50 states to embrace that vision of what marriage is. When the Constitution talks about equal protection under the law, it begs the question to say that a same-sex relationship is the same thing as a marriage between a man and a woman. It's only denying equality before the law if you assume that marriage is a genderless institution. But there's nothing in the Constitution that requires us to assume marriage is a genderless institution. So where the Constitution is silent, citizens remain sovereign. And so unelected judges shouldn't legislate from the bench. That's what happened in Roe v. Wade. There's nothing in the Constitution that says there's a right to privacy to kill your unborn child. And yet in January of 1973, unelected judges said there was. So between now and the end of June, it's incumbent upon us to make the case that we have constitutional authority to make marriage policy, and unelected judges shouldn't take that away from us. There are good arguments on both sides of this marriage debate, and that's exactly why citizens should engage in the debate, discuss, deliberate, and vote, not have our first right, the right to vote about public policy, taken away from us. Second point I want to make is that no matter what happens with the Supreme Court, we need to protect the rights of citizens to dissent from same-sex marriage. This is the importance of highlighting religious liberty rights and preventing sexual orientation and gender identity from being elevated to the level of a suspect class for non-discrimination law. Let me unpack both of those. When we've seen cases of the Christian adoption agencies or the florist, the baker, the photographer running in trouble with the law, normally it's been because there's a non-discrimination statute that the city or the state passed that added sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of protected classes. Sexual orientation and gender identity goes by an acronym SOGI, S-O-G-I, SOGI. And what they do is they take existing non-discrimination statutes that say you can't discriminate on the basis of race, for example, and then they insert sexual orientation and gender identity, and they say, well, you can't discriminate on that either. Many of the things that people in this chapel would just view as the requirements of chastity will now be redefined as discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. These are the sorts of laws that say if you don't let a male who has transitioned to be a female use the women's restroom, you're discriminating on the basis of gender identity. These are the sorts of laws that say if you don't take the wedding photos at a same-sex wedding, you're discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. These are the sorts of laws that Gordon College, an evangelical college in New England, is in trouble right now with the accrediting agency. They may lose their accreditation because they have a policy that every member of the Gordon College community, students and faculty and staff, have to live by the requirements of chastity, which means no sexual relationships outside of marriage, marriage understood as the union of a man and a woman. The argument now is that campus policy discriminates on the basis of sexual orientation. So while I doubt there's anyone who's in favor of discrimination, none of us want to see gays and lesbians mistreated, none of us want to see gays and lesbians losing their jobs for no reason. No one's in favor of that sort of discrimination. These anti-discrimination policies are overly broad, and they classify as discrimination many things that are entirely reasonable, entirely in keeping with the virtue of chastity. And so that's a concern, is not elevating sexual orientation and gender identity to a protected class like race. You don't want to equate traditional Christian beliefs about human sexual behavior with irrational racism. And that's what's at stake there. So preventing bad laws is one thing that can be done. The other thing that can be done is passing good laws. At the federal level, we have something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This was passed by Congress in 1993, a unanimous vote in the House of Representatives. 97 senators out of 100 voted for it, and President Bill Clinton signed it into law. This is the law that protected Hobby Lobby last year. Hobby Lobby won its Supreme Court case because of RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It is now being attacked like we've never seen before. Even though it passed unanimously in the House and Clinton signed it into law, Ted Kennedy was its sponsor. It's now being attacked as a license to discriminate, that RFRA protects the war on women and a license to discriminate against gays and lesbians. That's how the media is spinning this. Federal RFRA only protects against federal religious liberty infringements. So now it's something like, I think, 21 or 22 states have passed state-level RFRAs. And I apologize, I forgot to check to see if Oklahoma has a RFRA or not. If you don't, you should think about enacting a state-level RFRA that would prevent the state government from substantially burdening the free exercise of religion, except for when it's necessary, absolutely necessary. The test here is there has to be a compelling state interest that's being pursued in the least restrictive way possible. So this isn't kind of a trump card for religion and religious liberty, but this is a balancing test. It says if the government's going to impose upon the free exercise of religion, we need to make sure it's for a really serious reason, and they're doing it in the narrowest, least intrusive way possible. So what the Supreme Court did last year was they said, even if we assume that giving out free contraception is a compelling state interest, forcing the evangelical Green family to pay for it is not the least restrictive way of achieving this. There could be just a simple government handout of free contraception, and you don't even have to involve the Green family or the Hahn family in this plan. So obviously, there's a least restrictive way of accomplishing this issue that wouldn't involve religious liberty violations, and that's why Hobby Lobby won its lawsuit. So if the state of Oklahoma was to do something like that, whether it's on abortion funding or if it's going to be on some of these marital issues, having a state-level religious liberty protection would be helpful. Now, the third item I would mention is that those religious liberty protections are likely to be honored if people understand why we're acting on the belief that we are. You don't see religious liberty protections for racists because people think that racism is wholly irrational and utterly inappropriate. So in order to have religious liberty protections honored in the culture, for people who believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman, we have to explain why we believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. If the other side is successful as painting it as believing marriage is the union of a man and a woman is irrational bigotry akin to racism, you can expect to be treated the way that racists are treated. If you are successful at explaining to people why it's reasonable and rational to believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman, you can then be expected to be treated the way that reasonable, rational people are treated. That's going to be how this debate plays out in the future. Will people who believe that marriage is a male-female union be treated as reasonable and rational, or unreasonable and irrational? And the best way of thinking about this is to look to the pro-life community. I was an undergrad at Princeton. The vast majority of Princeton students and Princeton professors are pro-choice. But they don't think pro-lifers are irrational bigots. They think we're wrong, but they at least think we're reasonable. They can understand why a pro-lifer is concerned about the life in the womb. And as a result, they typically respect our religious liberty rights. They typically don't think a pro-life nurse should have to perform an abortion, or that a pro-life pharmacist should have to dispense abortion-causing drugs. They say, look, we disagree with the pro-life nurse and the pro-life pharmacist, but we understand why they believe what they believe, and so we're not going to coerce them. That's going to be the situation of people who believe the truth about marriage. Can we persuade the Princeton University campus that even though they disagree with us, that we're at least reasonable people who they don't need to coerce and eliminate from society? And the only way that'll happen is if they hear from people like you and me. If they only hear from the Westboro Baptist Church, they will conclude that we're irrational people who have to be eliminated from society. So we can't allow the Westboro Baptist Church to be our spokesperson. We have to be our own spokespeople. And I think that to a great extent, the past decade has been a debate between people on the left advocating for same-sex marriage, people on the right being silent, and then people on the far right being extreme, like the Westboro Baptist Church. And so we have to find our voices. The fourth thing I'll mention is that we also need to be better organized. Social conservatives have made great strides since Roe v. Wade. I mean, it's amazing to see the institutions and organizations that social conservatives have built in the 40 years since Roe. But we're nowhere near where other groups are. Think about the free market movement. Think about how well free market economics and libertarian think tanks, free market think tanks, advocacy groups, the Koch brothers, just go down the list and look at what people who want free trade and low taxes have as far as institutions and organizations and advocacy groups, and then compare that to what social conservatives have. It's not surprising that they get the majority of the airtime on Fox News and within the leadership of the political parties. If we want to change that, we have to be as organized, as well organized, as strategic, as prudent, and also we have to commit our resources to this. We typically tend to be outspent by both liberals and libertarians. The fifth thing I'll mention is that the church will, no matter what, play a decisive role in this future. It'll either play a role by being silent and being on the sidelines, so it'll play a role by default of allowing the culture to move forward without any opposition, or it'll play a constructive role by equipping the saints to engage in this task. And what we saw, I like doing the parallel between the pro-life movement and today. Think about what happened when Roe v. Wade was issued. The Southern Baptist Convention praised the Supreme Court's decision in Roe, saying that it was a good decision that honored the separation of church and state. The Southern Baptists at the time were mildly pro-choice. They thought abortion was just a Catholic issue. Today, the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest pro-life group in the United States. So what this shows us is that we shouldn't write off denominations or particular churches that might right now be bad on some of these marriage and sexuality issues. No one is a lost cause. And we see that most clearly on the abortion issue with the Southern Baptist Convention. It's amazing, though, especially now under the leadership of Russell Moore, but it was really the previous president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Richard Land, who got the Southern Baptist Convention to be on the right side of that issue. And now Russell Moore is leading the convention with great kind of grace, charm, and the right positioning for the 21st century's challenges. How will the church do that on this issue? I would say that in general, the church has not yet found an effective way to respond to the sexual revolution. So it's not just the same-sex marriage issue is one little piece in a much larger puzzle. And that for the past 40 or 50 years, Christians have not found a compelling, humane, attractive way of presenting biblical truths about human sexuality to a Hollywood culture. And that's going to be the task going forward. How do we make the truth about our humanity and our sexuality something that young people will embrace? That it's a liberating truth, not that it's a lie that will repress people's personalities or shackle them up with all of these rules and restrictions, that it's actually a truth that sets people free for happiness. The last thing that I'll mention, so then we can get to Q&A, is that we're going to have to take the long view. None of this is going to be won in the next election cycle. None of this is going to be won within the next decade. This will be an intergenerational campaign. We're trying to reform the culture. We're trying to reform the popular understanding about human sexuality and marriage. And here I think we take our cue directly from the pro-life movement. So when I started, I said, think back to the winter of 1972. Now let's jump to the winter of 1973. Go to February of 1973. So go back 42 years ago from right now. 42 years from right now, the pro-lifers had just been dealt a devastating defeat in Roe v. Wade. 2 weeks prior to that, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, says there's a constitutional right to abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. In the intervening weeks and years, we would see that more or less all of the elites in the media, in the universities, in politics, they would be saying, look, the pro-lifers have lost. They're on the wrong side of history. They would point to demographics. In the years after the Roe v. Wade decision, popular opinion shifted to be something like 2/3 in favor of abortion and only 1/3 being pro-life. The younger generation, 40 years ago, was almost entirely in favor of abortion because the Supreme Court had just taught them they had a constitutional right to it. The talking heads and the elites were saying that, pro-lifers will one day only be in nursing homes and inside the walls of the Vatican. Public officials, Jesse Jackson, Ted Kennedy, Al Gore, Bill Clinton, who started their public careers being pro-life, all evolved and became pro-choice. It would have been ridiculously easy for pro-lifers 42 years ago to say, well, we lost, time to give up and move on. But they didn't. And today, the majority of Americans identify as pro-life, and my generation is the most pro-life generation in the history of the United States. Over the past 2 weeks ago, I was in D.C. for the March for Life. 600,000 people come to Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago to March for Life, 42 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. And the vast majority of the people there are millennials. If you haven't been, I encourage you to go. It's one of the most uplifting, encouraging, though somber, kind of public protest marches. It's more like a vigil than a protest march that you can be a part of. How did this take place? During the past 42 years, pro-lifers got together. They created the pro-life organizations. They created the pro-life arguments, whether it's about biology and embryology or about constitutional law and judicial activism, about philosophy and ethics. They made it so each and every one of us can make the case for life. They crafted the public policies, the Hyde Amendment that prevented taxpayer funding of abortion, although Obamacare got around that. But otherwise, the Henry Hyde, he came up with that amendment. Ronald Reagan, yesterday was his birthday. He's the only sitting president to ever write a book while in the White House. And the title of his book was Abortion and the Conscience of a Nation. And it explained how abortion was violating the Declaration of Independence and our commitment to human equality and certain inalienable rights, including the right to life. He used the bully pulpit. He used his office as president to prick the conscience of the nation. We've seen hundreds and thousands of crisis pregnancy centers sprout up all across the United States. We've seen organizations like Feminists for Life and Students for Life and Silent No More and Americans United for Life and the Susan B. Anthony's. Go through the list. There's an endless array of groups. That's why we've seen the gains in public opinion over the past 40 years, and it's why the past decade, more pro-life laws were passed at the state level than in the previous 3 decades combined. The same thing now will need to happen on the marriage issue. It won't be the type of thing that can be won in the next election cycle. It may not be won in any of our lifetimes, but we have to take that long view that the pro-lifers took. And the utter conviction here is that we each have a vocation to bear witness to the truth, that God asks us to be faithful more than he asks us to be successful. And that witness to the truth is valuable for its own sake, but also that witness to the truth over time bears fruit. That lies cannot sustain themselves forever. Eventually, the truth wins out. So what I'll close with, and then we'll open it up for questions, is each and every one of us has a vocation to bear witness to the truth within our own particular lives. I happen to be a scholar and a think tank person, so I write articles and books and blog posts, and I make speeches and give lectures, and I make philosophical and public policy arguments. But some of you are pastors, and your vocation will be to make theological arguments, to explain what the Christian church believes about these issues. Your vocation will also be to form people to be good citizens, to know what the best philosophy and social science says. Some of you are artists, musicians, actors. How can you embody this vision of marriage rather than the vision that the television show Glee embodies? I think Glee has done more to corrupt young people than anything the Supreme Court has done. And what's the healthy alternative to Glee? That's going to be a role for an artist, perhaps someone who's majoring in drama. There'll be a role for homeschooling parents and homeschooling networks. How do you raise your children to not be seduced by a government-sponsored lie? There'll be room for universities, room for churches, room for Hollywood. More or less every aspect of society, there'll be a role for your particular vocation. It's not as if everyone has to do what I do, or everyone has to do what a university does, everyone has to do what a pastor does. Everyone has to do something within their own particular calling in life. And so that's where I'll leave it, and I'm happy to entertain questions. That's okay.
Same rules apply. I see a hand back here, so we'll start with the questions. We'll go for whatever appropriate amount of time is apparent here, 3, 4, 5 questions. So I'll start back here. Dr. Anderson, thank you for agreeing to field these. Again, ask a question, don't preach a sermon, and let him answer appropriately.
Okay, I definitely agree, that with what you said last night about the value of mom and dad and raising the child, that being God's plan. Just read Dennis Jernigan's book, which is similar to Dr. Butterfield. But the questions that I think are difficult are when you listen to homosexual theologians or Christians, and you think about what the state is trying to promote. The question that comes up to me, is. And I certainly believe that a homosexual Christian should seek God and that God can heal him. But for people that don't believe that, or just from a state government level, based on what you were talking about last night, would homosexual monogamy be better than homosexual promiscuity in terms of elderly caregiving, in terms of which is the state would have an interest in terms of a cost issue, in terms of child rearing. Would homosexual couple be better than no parents at all, like living in a state government home, which is having served in those places, I know what those are like for kids. And there's we're going to encounter more and more homosexuals wanting to be in our church. When I work with youth, the homosexuals are asking, the homosexual kids are asking, can we, be involved here? There's going to be homosexual couples. The church is trying to struggle with how to minister to those people, what role they have in the church. So, how are we going to respond to that?
Yep, great question. I think what I would say in response to that is that we don't want to kind of phrase or frame our alternatives as narrow as, is it better to have promiscuity or monogamy? Is it better to have no parents or gay parents? I think that leaves out the third alternative, which is the alternative that I think we should be advocating for. So to take the adoption question, yes, it's better to have gay parents than to have no parents, but it's ideal to have both a mother and a father. And so if there's a problem of there's not enough foster families or there are not enough adoptive families, that should really prompt all of us to think about what can we be doing to remedy that problem. Certainly shutting down Christian-run adoption agencies doesn't do anything to help that problem. The Catholic Charities in Boston that were shut down had a record of placing some of the hardest to place children with families, some of them special needs children. They were most effective at encouraging families to be willing to adopt some of the children that had the greatest needs. And yet they were shut down because they didn't want to do same-sex adoptions. And that just frames a false alternative. It's not as if either stay in a government institution or have no parents or be with a same-sex family. The third option is the one that I want to see embodied in public policy, which is find every orphan a home with a married mom and dad. And that's what we should be doing with our public policy. That's what we should be doing with our charities. It's what we should be doing with our church groups. There's a great group that focus on the family runs. It's called Wait No More. And what they do is they will go into church communities and they will say, in your state, there are however many hundred of children waiting to be adopted. We're here so they can wait no more. Are any of you willing to be adoptive families? And they have great success at this. They just go in. Once people know that there's the need here, they know how they can be empowered to meet the need, that their resources can be assisted by a group like Focus on the Family. They've been successful at matching children with families thousands of times. That's what I want to see more of. So I don't want to make it seem like we should settle for a less than best option for children who need to be adopted. I want to see what can we do to give every child a mother and a father. Same thing on the question of, is monogamy better than promiscuity? Yes, but why should we settle for that? And we should want chastity for everyone. And we should have our public policies and our culture support the truth about human sexuality for everyone. And so that's where I would just suggest that settling for kind of a second best does a disservice to really what is possible and what really is in the best interest of all of the community.
Well, okay. You said early when you were talking about RFRA, you said we need to pass laws on the state level because those have been successful. And I guess I'm a little bit confused because isn't that what we did with marriage laws? We passed them at the state level and then were passed over by the judicial system that we have. So I guess I'm not sure what good that will do. And also, is there anything we can do at the state level anymore because of, as far as marriage?
Yep.
Or is it all at individual level and what we do with our neighbors?
Great question. So on the RFRA level, none of the state RFRAs have been declared unconstitutional, and it's not even clear how you could make any plausible argument that they are unconstitutional, because we have a federal RFRA that the US Supreme Court just used last year to protect Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood. So it would be hard to say that a state-level RFRA somehow violated the US Constitution. All a state-level RFRA does is apply the type of protections that the First Amendment and federal RFRA apply to the federal government to state governments. And we've had state-level RFRAs for about 20 years now, and none of them have been declared unconstitutional. So I don't think that because there's been judicial activism on the marriage amendments, that shouldn't deter us from passing good policy on religious liberty. To your second question of what can be done on marriage, that a lot will hinge on what the Supreme Court does with oral arguments in April and then their decision in June. My best guess is that it'll be a 5-4 decision with Justice Kennedy casting the 5th vote, and I have no idea how Justice Kennedy will vote. I'm not even sure if he knows how he will vote yet. Based upon what he decided 2 years ago in the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, the logic of that opinion was that the Federal Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional because the federal government was failing to recognize same-sex marriages in the states that had redefined marriage, and that states have autonomy to make marriage policy. So the logic of that opinion should uphold the states that have retained the historic definition of marriage. We'll have to see whether or not Kennedy actually lives by the logic that he wrote 2 years ago. I mean, Kennedy does have a history of evolving on these things. But there's a good chance that it could be a 5-4 decision that upholds the Sixth Circuit decision. The Sixth Circuit Court upheld marriage laws in those 4 states. The Supreme Court should do the same thing. The Supreme Court should say the people in the states are free to make good marriage policy, and that they're not going to judge it one way or the other, whether it should be same-sex or opposite sex, at which point you in Oklahoma can defend your marriage law. You can continue passing good laws.
Hello. I haven't followed this recently for the last few weeks, but in New Jersey there was a biological father-daughter couple who were intending on being married and having kids, and according to the definition, I agree with you about marriage being monogamous, exclusive, and permanent. It seems that they would qualify on all of those accounts, but how would you offer a correction to that viewpoint?
Yep. So the basic argument from last night's talk isn't that the consenting adult romance vision of marriage can't be monogamous, exclusive, and permanent. It's that that vision of marriage has no reason for requiring monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency. That there's no principal basis for monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency once you cut off the male-female sexual complementarity, procreation aspect of marriage. That monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency follow from sexual complementarity. And so the major concern with redefining marriage is that you cut off the rationale of the institution. And that what we see over time is that when you desiccate an institution, it dries up little by little. So once you cut off the roots, the male-female part, it'll only be a matter of time before the monogamy, the exclusivity, and the permanency part become optional. And in saying they become optional, that means some people might choose them. So the couple you described might choose to be in a monogamous, exclusive, permanent relationship, but they might not. And that's why we want the law to be able to give a coherent account of itself. We want the law to be able to say, this is why we expect marriage to be monogamous, exclusive, and permanent. In the case of this adoptive couple, my question would be, why does that child not deserve to have a mother? Is that adoption in the best? You're saying it's a same-sex couple who's adopting a child, or? Oh, to each other. Yes. All right. So here, I mean, I think I didn't even. Wow. Now I know what you're talking about. Here, I think this is one of the problems with the love equals love slogan. There are different types of love, and paternal love is not the same thing as spousal love. And so I think part of the problem with the push to redefine marriage for same-sex couples is that it levels a rich tapestry of love into a lowest common denominator. So another problem that we point to in the very last chapter of our book is that redefining marriage will actually make it harder for people with same-sex attractions to live out chastity. Because what redefining marriage says is marriage is the most important relationship, and that marriage has whatever your other relationships have, but more, and it has it to a greater extent. We have a dearth of serious friendship in the United States. You see a lot of revisionist historians. They'll read the journals of people like Abraham Lincoln, or the letters that the founding fathers would send to each other, and they're like, oh, they were all gay. Abraham Lincoln's gay, George Washington's gay, all the founding fathers were gay because they had affectionate male friendships. And the answer is no, they weren't gay. It's just that they had a richer tapestry of human loves. That there was spousal love, but there was also love between brothers, love between friends. And part of the problem here would be to conflate all of those things as love equals love. And it doesn't say anything to detract from your love that you don't have sexual relationships with the person whom you love. And you shouldn't have a sexual relationship with your children. You shouldn't have a sexual relationship with your friends. And it's actually, the progressives think that every generation is more progressive and better equipped than the previous ones. No, I think we've actually gone backwards on our understanding of human love and human friendship. And that Lincoln and the founders had a much healthier understanding of this, that you could have real meaningful relationships that were non-sexual. And that's what we're losing in the United States. There's a great essay by Anthony Esolen. He's an English professor at Providence College titled A Requiem for Friendship. And he's also done a lot of good explanations for why the Boy Scouts shouldn't have open gay members. Because he says, once you insert an element of eroticism, it kills the potential for friendship. And that's, so the title of it was in the magazine, Touchstone magazine. Touchstone is a journal of mere Christianity. That's their tagline. So it's Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox Christians all published together in Touchstone. And Anthony Esolen, it's probably a decade old now. You can Google it. It's not behind a paywall. It's open to anyone. A Requiem for Friendship. It's one of the best things I've read on this particular question of how getting the family wrong will have consequences for friendship, especially for male friendship. Because if you're a guy that has a serious male friendship, the next thing that'll happen is people will start saying, well, maybe he's gay. And it conflates real friendship with something that has to be erotic. Yep.
Your analogy to the pro-life movement's tactics and its successes is heartening, but that strategy has been necessarily incremental. We've chipped away with parental consent laws and time frames and all kinds of funding issues. Are there any incremental approaches that people could take in a jurisdiction that does have same-sex marriage?
Sure. I think the first incremental step would be protecting the religious liberty rights of universities and colleges and adoption agencies and businesses and individuals to be free from embracing same-sex marriage. So in the same way that one of the first things the pro-life movement did was make sure that you could be a pro-life doctor or a pro-life nurse or a Catholic hospital and not be forced to perform abortions. So the very first thing they did was protect their conscience rights. I think we'll have to do the same thing. Incrementally, it's a little bit harder because it's not like there's a 9-month window that you can move. It's going to be it's either marriage is male, female, or it's gender neutral. So the other thought I'll have there is that one of the greatest tools for the pro-life movement has been ultrasound. How many of you found out that you were going to be a grandparent by when your children sent you an email with an ultrasound picture attached? How many of you have an ultrasound picture on your refrigerator of one of your children or grandchildren? It's very hard to deny that that's a child. No one refers to, oh yeah, that's my fetus. It's just, when it's your grandchild, you don't say, oh yeah, let me show you the ultrasound of my fetus. It's not how people talk, because our language reflects reality, and the reality is that that unborn child is a baby. And that's, oh, let me show you my grandbaby. He or she is due in 3 months, 4 months. What we're seeing now is that the social science and some of the personal narratives have the potential to be the ultrasound of the marriage movement. In the same way that Nancy Pelosi has tried to speak for all women on the abortion issue, there have been some gay rights activists who try to speak for all same-sex attracted people on the marriage issue. And we're now seeing people who will write articles with titles like, "I'm gay and I'm against gay marriage," or "Growing Up with Two Moms, the Untold Child's Story," or an essay that was published this Monday at Public Discourse. So both of the previous two essays I've mentioned were published at Public Discourse. The third one that I'll mention was published just earlier this week. It was titled, "Dear Justice Kennedy, Take It from a Child of a Loving Gay Parent, Redefining Marriage Harms Children." And so this was, Katie Faust is the author of this essay. She was explaining, look, I was raised by a loving mom in a lesbian relationship, but I wish I would have had a dad. And redefining marriage will cause harm to the children, not only in same-sex relationships, but in all of America, because redefining marriage undermines the institution of marriage. It makes it less likely that people get married in the first place or that they stay married for the long haul. Those voices are much more effective at this than I am. They can speak from personal experience. And the LGBT left has done everything they can to try to silence those voices. I've seen the hate that has been leveled at Katie since she published her essay with us on Monday. But she's not intimidated. She's willing to speak out. Bobby Lopez is willing to speak out. Doug Mainwaring, willing to speak out. Rosaria Butterfield, willing to speak out. Those are going to be the voices, I think, that will catch people by surprise, because they assume that Andrew Sullivan or Chad Griffin, that they speak for the entire LGBT community. And when you discover that there are people within that community who have a very different view on these things and can speak from experience of what it's like growing up without a mother or without a father, it's powerful.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's been wonderful. And the question I have is, with the upcoming Supreme Court case, do we know who's representing it and what the nature of their arguments will be?
So I don't think they've announced yet who's going to be representing the 4 states in the Sixth Circuit. The people who represented them at the Sixth Circuit when they had the case, what was it, maybe 6 months ago, it was the state attorney generals. This was good. You probably have seen that there have been some states where the governor and the attorney general just refuse to defend the law, and they lose by default. That's what happened in California. The governor and the attorney general refused to defend Prop 8, so when it got to the Supreme Court said, well, no one has standing, because only the governor and the attorney general can defend a state law. In Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky, the governors instructed the attorney generals to defend those laws, and they did, and they succeeded at the Sixth Circuit. And so it's my understanding that the states themselves will be defending their laws, but they haven't yet announced who will be doing oral arguments. And that's really important. You know, who will be the lawyer that stands before the 9 judges and, on their feet when they're being peppered with all of these questions can give good responses. And obviously I'll do whatever I can to try to make sure that they've seen the research and the writing that I've done on this so that they know, the answers that I would give. But there are lots of people who have done research on this, and they're going to be trying to soak up as much as they can. The types of arguments they've made is that there are good policy arguments on both sides of this question, and so it's reasonable for citizens to debate, discuss it, and vote about it. The majority of citizens in this state considered the arguments and came to the conclusion that the historic definition of marriage is the correct definition of marriage. They weren't acting out of anti-gay animus. They were acting for the common good. They were rational in doing so. The 14th Amendment doesn't preclude them from doing so. A simple appeal to equality doesn't answer the question of what marriage is. The 14th Amendment allows us to treat different relationships in different ways, and that a union of a man and a woman is a different type of union than the union of a man and a man or a woman and a woman. They point out that whenever the Supreme Court has talked about a fundamental right to marry, it's always understood marriage as a union of a man and a woman, and it's explained why there's a fundamental right to marry precisely because of the procreative aspect of marriage and the ability of uniting children with a mother and a father. When they say that marriage is essential to our civilization, They're not saying that because consenting adult romance is essential to our civilization. The Supreme Court said that because we need to have the next generation, and we need an institution that will create and then raise the next generation. That's why marriage is essential to our civilization. So they just pointed out that even according to the Supreme Court's own jurisprudence about the fundamental right to marry, the entire rationale has been that it's a male-female union. So how can you say that the citizens of Ohio, when they voted for marriage as the union of a man and woman, were violating the Constitution? So they go through, I mean, there's a series of arguments that they make. They try to more or less prevent any of the appeals, whether it's from equality or fundamental rights or the 14th Amendment or even the Windsor decision. They explain why, when the Supreme Court struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, they were actually highlighting that the states have authority over the marital relationship. And so now they shouldn't come in and say the federal courts have authority over the marital relationship. They also point out why Loving v. Virginia is not similar to this. They point out that Loving v. Virginia is the case that struck down the bans on interracial marriage. And they say that there were no bans on interracial marriage throughout human history until the American colonies created them to prop up the slave trade. America is the first political community throughout human history to ever ban interracial marriage. It wasn't banned in the common law tradition. It wasn't banned in early Judaism or Christianity. It was only in the American colonies, and they had to ban interracial marriage in order to prop up a race-based system of slavery. If you have interracial marriage, you have interracial children, and then over the generations, you can't have a race-based form of segregated slavery. So what they did was they redefined marriage to make race a factor, when at the common law and at our whole human history, race was irrelevant to marriage, which is why you don't see Plato or Aristotle or Augustine or Aquinas or Luther or Calvin or any of these great thinkers discussing marriage in terms of skin color. The reason the government issued marriage license in terms of skin color was that they were propping up an unjust system of slavery. And so what the court did was they pointed this out. They said it's irrational to think that skin color has anything to do with marriage, and that's why interracial marriage bans are unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment was passed precisely to eliminate that type of irrational racism. 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War to protect an equal protection of laws for the newly freed slaves. But to then make the argument that the 14th Amendment requires to redefine marriage to make it a genderless institution is simply judicial activism. There's no basis in the logic, the history, or the text of the 14th Amendment to require that. And so anyway, they've been good at making that argument as well. I mean, they anticipated each and every argument that the left might make about marriage. They provided a response to it, and they persuaded the judges on the Sixth Circuit Court. And now, hopefully, they'll persuade the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court.
You've done a great job presenting the legal and philosophical arguments. Who, in your opinion, is best at promoting the theological arguments and some of the biblical arguments? And is there a really good set of books you'd recommend from some of these authors?
Sure. Robert Gagnon at, I think it's the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, has really done, I think, the best work on the Bible and same-sex relationships, the Bible and marriage. I think he's done a really good job at this. Richard Hayes at Duke Divinity School, I mean, this is probably 20 years ago that he wrote a seminal article on the New Testament and same-sex marriage and same-sex relationships in general. That was an article that was assigned to me when I was an undergraduate at Princeton and I was taking an ethics class. You know, that's how prominent the Richard Hayes article is. If I'm remembering his name right, I think it's Daniel Dreimbach. He's at one of the Baptist seminaries. He also has two quite good books on this. I also think The Theology of the Body, a series of addresses that John Paul II gave, Wednesday audiences that he gave, is really insightful. It's not specifically on the same-sex question, but this is back in the late 70s, early 80s. He gives a series of addresses that flowed out of his experience as a college chaplain. And he said that people just don't have a sound understanding of the theology of the body. And so it's been published as Male and Female, He Created Them, A Theology of the Body. And it's really, I think it's quite insightful. And before that, before he became Pope John Paul II, He was a philosophy professor in Krakow, and he wrote a book called Love and Responsibility. And it just laid out a philosophical, theological account of love and the responsibility attendant upon love. Those would be some of the places I would start on these questions.
Dr. Anderson, thank you again, as people said, for the way you've presented. I'm going to ask you, if you would, to encourage us with some ideas and ways, some practical things. You've touched on a couple of matters here. You said that we should find our voices so that organizations or groups like Westboro Baptist Church don't become our voice. You've said that the church has not yet found a good and appropriate response to the sexual revolution. Knowing that often it is the loudest or the squeakiest or the shock factorist groups and voices that get attention, what from your experience, the position you have, just some ideas, some thoughts, some suggestions about ways to find voices, ways to respond appropriately to the sexual revolution from a standpoint of the church and individuals who love the Lord?
Yeah, great question. I would start by saying, what sort of Sunday school program does your local church have to educate young people to have a Christian imagination about these issues? It's not enough that they can just kind of cite the right verses in the Bible, but have they internalized it so that this is the framework that they view the world through? Do they have the right lenses to interpret their own sexuality and the relationships that they'll be forming from a Christian perspective? That's where I would start. So before I even concern about who's getting the airtime on the nightly news, realize that we have a captive audience each and every Sunday morning. Are we equipping them? And I don't know what the answer is. It may be that the church you belong to really does have a great program. I would say my experience has been a lot of churches just don't know what to do on this. And I don't know. I'm not kind of a youth group leader. I'm not a Sunday school teacher. So I'm probably not going to be the one that develops this. But there are people who have those callings to really form teenagers, to teach teenagers, to make accessible the types of arguments we've been talking about yesterday and today, not just that young people can understand them, but that young people can embody them, internalize them. What would that look like? I don't know. But that's where I would start. I think the most important thing that we can do in the short run, so the next 10, 20 years, is prevent our own children from believing a lie. Because the public schools and the government and Hollywood will be working at cross purposes from what you're trying to do with your own children. What they get in the public schools, what they get from the government, what they get from Hollywood will be what you see on the TV show Glee, which is that consenting adults or even consenting teenagers should do whatever consenting teenagers want to do. That provided it's consensual, provided it's safe, so you're on the pill or you're using a condom, provided there's no coercion, and provided you feel ready, you should do what you want to do. We need to find a response to that. And that's where I would start. The second thing I would do after that is, if someone, let's say you're at work, you work for a secular company, the Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments about marriage, it's in the newspapers, it's in the evening news, and one of your colleagues says, so what do you think about the Supreme Court case? Are you prepared to give a winsome answer? That's what I mean by finding our voice. I think most people will try to avoid that situation. They don't want to cause controversy at work. They don't want to, make an enemy at the water cooler. Is there a way in which each of us can find a way to answer that question that's not off-putting, that's not confrontational, that's winsome and loving, but that's also truthful? And to do that, I think it will actually require homework. You'll have to think through, well, if I get a question, how do I answer that in a way that will be loving but also truthful? And that's something I don't think we're yet fully prepared for. If you are, that's wonderful, and kudos to you, because my experience has been the majority of us aren't ready for that. And so it's the type of thing that we have to prepare ourselves for. How to talk to our neighbors, how to talk to our work colleagues in a way that will be accessible to them. So if you're talking to a non-believer, appealing to the Bible won't be particularly helpful for them. So can you make an argument that meets them where they are? And, when St. Paul says, to the Jew I became a Jew, to the Roman I became a Roman, to the Greek I became a Greek. To the secularist, can you become a secularist? To show them that even on the basis of reason alone, the best answers point in the direction of male-female marriage. To a fellow Christian, you might be able to say, wait, you got your theology wrong about this. Think it through theologically. You need to have all of those arrows in your quiver. So with that, I think we are out of time. Thank you, guys.